All right, so chapter 12, the Second War for Independence and the Upsurge of Nationalism. So we're going to be talking about Madison's presidency, and then a little bit we'll go into Monroe's presidency. So in the intro, we're talking, of course, about the Second War for Independence, aka the War of 1812. So we had already declared our independence from Britain during the Revolution, but now we're kind of growing up as a nation and we're kind of declaring, our independence in a sense as we're adults now. Okay? So we're kind of like teenagers growing up wanting to be treated like adults. America's growing up, we want to be treated like every other country. So it was a weird war because there was people were kind of apathetic about it. There were those war hawks that were in Congress that really hated Britain, that really loved the war, but other than the war hawks, people were kind of unimpressed by it. They could give or take, whatever. Okay, now we're in war with Britain. Like, this is weird. And, and there was a lot of just disunity in the country at this time. Remember, it's the South and the West where our war hawks are coming from, our Democratic Republicans who really like this war, and then, New England more or less wants to pretend this is not happening. So there's a lot of national disunity about this war, and besides our war hawks, there's no one really, gunning for it. So it's kind of a strange war in that sense. All right, so let's talk about Section A, on to Canada over land and lake. So remember, Britain is in Canada at this time. So if we're going to be fighting Britain, we are most likely going to be fighting in Canada, mostly because that's where the British forces are the weakest. So if we want to win, we're going to be fighting in Canada. So our army, remember, we've had some Democratic Republicans in control. They dislike a big army, so our army is super pathetic. They're ill-trained, they're ill-disciplined. Our generals are kind of old and crusty, senile. Okay, these are people who were veterans of the American Revolution. So our soldiers, or our generals, I should say, are really kind of getting up in age, which isn't a wonderful thing when it comes to war. And our army, our national army, or a regular army, regular meaning our national army, was so small that we had to really rely on those individual state militias, or the state armies, to really help supplement our national army. So when I say militia, I mean state army. When I say regular army, I mean national army. So we really were depending on the state armies to fight this war. So, we start in Canada, as we usually do, with a bad strategy. Oh boy, who'd have thunk? So our strategy was kind of to split up our army, which was a bad idea because our army was really weak in the beginning. So we split the army into 3 different chunks and then attacked 3 different spots of Canada. Each time we attacked, Canada was easily able to defend us or to kind of beat us back. So we were never actually successful in invading Canada. We never tend to be anyway. So, Isaac Brock was the general, the British general, who was pretty good at defending Canada. And also your book mentions, General Mud and General Confusion. It's a pun, okay? There's no person named Mud. They're just talking about, remember this time, the roads were super horrible. You get stuck, waist deep, maybe not waist deep, but you get stuck in mud. So when you're trying to invade Canada, it's a hard thing to do. So, what a better strategy would have been is to just attack Montreal. Just everyone not attack these little forts in groups, but everyone group together and attack Montreal. That would have been a wonderful idea. We just didn't do that. Remember during the French and Indian War, it was a similar idea. We didn't get our act together in the French and Indian War, and we hadn't learned from our mistakes. So we're still trying to split our army up, and it's not working. So the British had a better strategy. The British fought to gain control of the Great Lakes. Good job, Britain. So that's what they were doing, and that was wonderful. But what was kind of surprising about this war is the fact that our Navy surprisingly did really well Good job, Navy. So if we were to have a battle on land, and then we were to have a battle on sea, it was much more, or on water, sea, whatever, water, we were much more likely to win that battle if it was on water during this war. And you can think of different reasons. One is all of those people in the Navy, all of these sailors have that passionate hate for Britain. Remember, because it was the British who were impressing or forcing American sailors to be a part of the British Navy. So these sailors have a fresh and passionate hatred for Britain. So maybe that was a factor as well. Who knows? But in the most part, during our invasion of Canada, it didn't really work, we were much better. Our Navy was much better. Let's see what else. Oh, something else that happens at this time is Napoleon in France. We talk more about France in this class than we should. Isn't this American history? Well, anyway, at this time in France, Napoleon actually loses power. So Napoleon is exiled to an island. So here we are, America. We weren't necessarily allies with France at this time, but it was always nice to know that France had a common hatred with Britain, so we shared that. So now that Napoleon's out of power, we don't have France to kind of fall back on. So we were, how does the book say it? We now had to face the music alone against Britain. France was not there anymore as kind of a safety net to help us out if things went wrong. We're in this alone. One of maybe the most famous battles, or important, I should say, strategically important battles that we actually won was called the Battle at Plattsburgh, Battle of Plattsburgh. And what happened here is our lovely British soldiers, our redcoats in Canada, are sending 10,000 of their troops or of their people down the Lake Champlain. Good job. Roads are horrible, so they're using water. So there's 10,000 troops, British troops, heading down, and their idea was to attack New York, overtake New York. And if they had been successful, that would have been absolutely devastating to America. We're not so sure we would have been able to recover from such a defeat. So fortunately, we were able to fend off those 10,000 redcoats that are coming down from Canada. So what it was, it's a 30-year-old Thomas MacDonough in a Navy battle. Good job, Navy. Remember, our Navy's much better in the War of 1812 than our Army. He was able to force the British into retreat, which saved New York, which it's not going outside the box to say saved our country. I paused so you can let that sink in. It's kind of a big deal. So that's called the Battle of Plattsburgh, when our friend Thomas MacDonough was able to save New York by fending off those 10,000 troops. All right, so next section, Washington burned and New York defended. So this is kind of talking again about some more battles and things that happened militarily in the War of 1812. So let's start with a defeat. Why not? So 4,000 redcoats of course mean British soldiers, land in the Chesapeake Bay. All right, we have an army that goes to conquer them. We have 6,000 militiamen at Bladensburg that try to defend America against these redcoats, but they pretty much were ill-trained and they were scared off and they pretty much just fled after this battle. So because we were kind of wimps and fled at the Battle of Bladensburg, that's a fun word, because we fled at this battle, these 4,000 troops were then able to march right into Washington, D.C. and literally light the Capitol on fire. Do you know that ever happened? Yeah, that happened. They literally lit the Capitol on fire. They burnt it down. You didn't know that happened. I bet you did, because you actually read your book, so of course you knew that happened. But that was kind of like a defeat, when the enemy burns down your capital. You can kind of chalk that up as a defeat. So let's talk about some victories now. Okay, so this section is now talking about how the Redcoats were then trying to attack us at Fort McHenry, which is in Baltimore, or outside of Baltimore, so Baltimore. So this is kind of cool because we are actually able to defend Baltimore against the Redcoats, but also because of this lovely gentleman whose name is Francis Scott Keyes. Francis Scott Keyes is at this time watching all of this go down, watching Baltimore, aka Fort McHenry, being attacked by the British, but we're able to defend this fort. And he writes this lovely song called the Star-Spangled Banner, right? The song we sing before football games, right? So, but our flag was still there. That was lovely and off tune. But that's what he's talking about. The Star-Spangled Banner is talking about our ability to defend Baltimore against the British in the War of 1812. This is just so interesting, I know. So Star-Spangled Banner comes out of that, and also we defend Baltimore. Good job. And then another huge victory for us comes with the battle at New Orleans. Okay. So the thing you should know before we get into the Battle of New Orleans is actually this battle goes down after the war ends. Remember, there was no Twitter at this time, no Facebook, no email, no phones. So the peace was actually signed ending the war over in Europe. And then it takes some time for that news to get back to America. So in that kind of gap of time between the peace treaty actually being signed and that news actually reaching America, the Battle of New Orleans goes down. So technically this battle happened after the war concluded, but really it is super important for a number of reasons, which we'll get to. So New Orleans, we have our man Andrew Jackson, American guy, obviously, you should know that. So Andrew Jackson is kind of in command of this hodgepodge group of soldiers. He's got sailors, he's got pirates, he's got Frenchmen, he has free blacks, he has militiamen or people from different states. There's kind of this hodgepodge team of go-getters. And what they do is they kind of entrench themselves. So they build barriers, they kind of get ready to fight, and the British kind of take the bait. The British have a full frontal assault on the Americans. And it was just devastating for the British. Once again, British, bad strategy. This may be, this Battle of New Orleans might be reminiscent of, what's that battle called? Revolutionary War, Bunker Hill. Remember that? The British, we were entrenched and the British went right up the hill, like really bad strategy. Well, guess what? That same sort of thing happens in the Battle of New Orleans. We were entrenched. The British come and get us, going full frontal assault. We were able then, in a half hour, to kill or wound 2,000 of their men, while only we had 70 American casualties. When I say casualties, and just in general, casualties does not mean deaths. Casualty means deaths or injuries. So when we say we have 70 American casualties, that doesn't mean 70 Americans died. That means 70 Americans were either killed or wounded. So obviously this is a huge victory for America. 2,000 dead or wounded. British versus just only 70 Americans casualties. So big victory. And this really bolsters Jackson's representation. What is that? I never can pronounce that word. But really bolsters Jackson's street cred, okay? He becomes this national hero, household name. Awesome. So like I said before, the peace treaty actually ending the war was signed 2 weeks before the battle, but that wasn't a big deal. This is a huge kind of boost in ego for America, a huge surge of nationalism for America. We won, and we won good. It's like winning the homecoming game, right? Just a huge boost of nationalism comes from the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson becomes a hero. All right, so let's go to section C, the Treaty of Ghent. And this is the treaty, of course, that ends the War of 1812. The War of 1812 ends in a draw, saying that, it just kind of stops the fighting. We regain the territory that we had lost. Britain, it just kind of goes back to the way it was before the war. We just stop fighting. And the people who kind of make this happen is our friends, the Russians, because the Russians are allies with Britain. So the Russians want British to concentrate in Europe and stop fighting with America already. So it was really Tsar Alexander I of Russia who really gets this peace treaty going, because he wants Britain to stop focusing on America and start focusing on Europe because they're allies. Something else that's going on at this time in Europe is something called the Congress of Vienna. Because, like I said, during the War of 1812, Napoleon loses power. And Napoleon had more or less taken over a lot of Europe. So now Europe was left to kind of pick up the pieces of Napoleon. Who gets what, who's in charge where, that sort of thing. So the Congress of Vienna was distracting Britain at this time as well. And plus, our victories at Baltimore and New York, or at least victories meaning they weren't able to overtake us there. Those things kind of gave us a better negotiation strategy. So in the end, the War of 1812 just stops. No one really wins. It just stops. So the armistice was signed 1814 on Christmas Eve, and yeah, it was kind of cool. Yeah, I don't like fighting, and when fighting ends, that makes me happy. All right, Section D, Federalist grievances and the Hartford Convention. So like we talked about kind of last chapter, there was a big kind of sectionalism starting to develop in America. New England really was a stronghold of the Federalist Party. They really liked Britain, which means they really hated the War of 1812. And then the South and the West were really big fans of the War of 1812, and they really hated Britain. So we're starting to see the sectionalism start. So New Englanders during this war acted atrociously. They definitely were more helpful to the British than they were to the Americans. They gave an example called blue light Federalists, that Federalists would put a blue light in their window when they knew an American ship was going to try to escape the British blockade. So even this example just showing that they were literally helping the British during this war through this blue light warning system, just really goes to show how the Federalists were just acting horribly. And something else that the Federalists do during this time is they have representatives from 5 different states meet for 3 weeks at something they call the Hartford Convention. So it's a bunch of Federalists meeting together. And they weren't going to break away from the country necessarily, but they were just ticked off about the War of 1812, and they wanted America to do something about it. So some of the demands they wanted, they asked for financial assistance to compensate for all this lost trade due to the embargo. They asked for an amendment to the Constitution requiring 2/3 vote in Congress before an embargo would happen. They wanted to get rid of the 3/5 compromise, which really benefited the southern states. They wanted a 1-term presidency, and they wanted to make a rule that no two successive presidents could be from the same state. So remember, we had a lot of these presidents are coming from Virginia. They didn't like that, so they wanted to get rid of this. So they had just this, laundry list of grievances or things they wanted to change. So after these 3 weeks of meeting in secrecy, they send 3 representatives or 3 envoys to D.C. to demand, to make their demands known. And really, it seems, in a national perspective, really, really petty. It's like, we're fighting a war here. You are sitting at a convention doing nothing to help us win this war, and you're making a list of all of your complaints. It seemed really petty to the rest of the world, or to the rest of America. And it was kind of like the death dirge of the Federalist Party. Kind of put the nail in the coffin of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party is more or less bumped now, okay? Because they kind of betrayed us during the War of 1812, and they came with this list of petty grievances, at least petty in the national perspectives. So yeah, that was the Federalist Grievances and the Hartford Convention. So let's talk about Section E, the Second War for Independence. All right, so this is talking about the War of 1812. Like I said, America's growing up. They want to assert their right as a big country now. They want to be seen as, on their own, kind of like a teenager wanting to be seen as an adult. America wants to be seen as a grown-up country. So in the big perspective of things, the War of 1812, globally speaking, was of little significance. Really, it wasn't. Most of Europe was worried more or less about what to do now that Napoleon left or Napoleon was exiled. So the War of 1812 is almost kind of like a side item. Okay, no one really cared about it. There's only 6,000 American casualties in this, but what it really helped to do was bolster nationalism and give us this sense of pride in our country. Because before, maybe people saw themselves as a Virginian or a New Yorker. They saw themselves more kind of as a member of a state. Now, after the War of 1812, we're growing up, we're growing together, we're seeing us more as America, not just a Virginian, but an American. So yeah, we gain respect nationally, showing that we're going to stick up for our rights. It kills the Federalist Party because they act horribly during the War of 1812. We get some new national heroes. We have Jackson from New Orleans. We have Harrison, which we talked about last time from the Battle of Tippecanoe. Let's see. Yeah, and because the British are no longer helping the Native Americans out, the Native Americans actually gave up a huge tract of land north of the Ohio River, so we get some more land from the Native Americans. And because of this British blockade that had been in effect throughout the war, and before the war as well, but throughout the war, because we had this British blockade, that really bolstered our industry, that really helped us create factories and things like that, because we couldn't rely on Britain anymore. We had to figure it out for ourselves, so that really bolstered manufacturing, which is great for economic independence. Because the more manufacturing we can do on our own, the less we're going to be depending on, Britain or France to do this. So it really grows us up. It really kind of gives us some economic independence. All right. Something that this section talks about is the Bush-Bagot Agreement. And what this is, it's signed between Britain and the United States, and it establishes strict limits on naval armaments in the Great Lakes. So it really says, hey, okay, remember, Britain is still in Canada. They're still kind of our neighbors to the north here, but it really sets some limits on how much they can arm their ships in the Great Lakes. And it's kind of the first step towards full demilitarization of the border. So this is kind of the first step to creating a friendly border with Canada. And today we have the longest friendly border in the world between Canada and the United States, but we got there one step at the time. First step is this Bush-Bagot Agreement. All right. And with that, the next video, we're going to kind of pick up on what we do in America now that we have ended the War of 1812.